Welcome back, everybody, to Mid-Tier Thoughts. We are going to be talking about battle rifles today. We're going to be talking about everything about them, from what they are, why they are, how they are, if you should care, if you shouldn't, why you should have one, pros and cons, how to employ them, and how to employ them in a team setting. So before we dive into that, let's give a special thanks to Blackout Coffee. Blackout Coffee is an awesome coffee sponsor of ours. They sponsor us all the time. We have a discount code with them to where you can get 20% off of your first order from them. So you can definitely save some money on some awesome coffee. And the money that you do wind up spending on your coffee will also help go to protecting your firearms rights. A lot of the times they support and actually have whole coffee brands that where all the money you spend to that, most of it will go to that company, such as Gun Owners America, Second Amendment Foundation, organizations like this that are actively fighting in court cases to get you your rights back. So definitely help look them up, check them out. Any money you spend there, help support them, help support you, and help support us. So with that being said, let's dive into it and let's talk about battle rifles. So I think it's important that we kind of define what we're talking about. We're talking about battle rifles. So in my head, a battle rifle is a semi-automatic, magazine-fed, shoulder-fired rifle chambered in either 308 or 6.5. Realistically, I'm kind of narrowing this down to 308, but I know there are 6.5 versions of these, and people enjoy 6.5. So I'm making 6.5 kind of as a ad hoc thing here, but most of the time I'll be talking about these in 308. So to kind of give some examples of classic battle rifles and kind of wrap your head around what I'm talking about. Some of the things we're going to be talking about are going to be like the G3 from H&K or the PTR 91, the FAL, the SCAR, even the 308 Galil, AR-10, anything along that nature. They've got 308 Tavors, really any kind of battle rifle that you could imagine, and it comes to your head with this. If you really want to stretch the limits, you can get to like the 308 version of the Keltec RDB. I don't really want to go that route, but you could. So if there's even like I think Sega makes some 308 AKs. I'm not necessarily including a lot of those, or maybe it's Zastava that does. I'm not necessarily including a lot of those in this. Kind of sticking it more towards the FAL, G3, and AR-10 / SCAR platform here. But any of these could kind of fit the role of what we're going to be talking about. So when we're talking about battle rifles, it's obviously not just your standard 5.56 AR-15. It's not, an AK or a heavy barreled AK or anything like that. So we're talking about a higher caliber rifle, and specifically magazine fed to be able to do quick magazine changes. We're not including M1 Garands. You're not putting in 8 rounds of .6 or anything like that. I'm not including specialty ARs where I've seen like AR-15s that are in like, like a 4570 or 4570 auto or anything like that. We're not including any of that weird stuff. We're trying to keep it kind of aligned with, normality. So now that we've kind of got the definitions out of the way, let's look at, for example, why are we talking about this? Well, I think that with a lot of the Minuteman community, there's kind of this idea of, starting to structure a team a little bit and having specific roles. Now, ideally, it would make sense to have a lot of people with an AR-15. Everyone's running the same platform. Everyone's having the same logistics. It's a lot easier to supply that way. However, if you get to a point when you're in your training with other people to where you can get to the point to start developing specialty roles. Garand Thumb put out a video recently about, having a DMR and the importance of that from the civilian setting and having that standoff distance. I think that it's important to start looking at things in the 308-6.5 realm outside of just the 5.56. Now, at the 5.56, you could obviously do like an SPR type of build or any kind of marksman rifle, something like that. You could do something like that to where that might work for you, but I think having the ability to have a higher caliber rifle that can reach out a little bit further and deliver a little bit more effect on target at distance is a little bit more effective way to do that. So I think there's a lot of positives to looking into this and a lot of positives into just having that thought process of like, okay, so let's say like, what if we do have one? How could we employ it? What could we use it for? And we'll dive into that a little bit later as far as like uses of these. But let's look at like, for example, some of the pros of having one. One, obviously you get a little bit further standoff distance. 308 is a little bit beefier cartridge, so a 6.5, you're able to reach out a lot further and deliver a lot more force on target at a distance to give you that kind of safety gap that you could have that you don't necessarily have from a 5.56. So I think that realistically, most of civilians, it's kind of hard to simulate having a light squad weapon or any type of like civilian version saw or AR RPK. Like they can be done, and they are becoming more popular now. Since the FRT triggers are kind of back on the menu, and there's other things out there. But even then, it can be kind of hard to come up with something that can kind of compete with a true machine gun, and doing it in a way that actually makes sense logistically. So I think a lot of people, it's more attainable to have some type of DMR or standoff rifle than it is to have the AR-RPK concept. Now, I think that the AR-RPK concept, we've done a video on that in the past, and I think it still deserves its place. But I think that your average group of people setting out, realistically, nowadays, if you're in a group of people who are like, hey, we're concerned citizens, we want to get together and we want to, kind of protect ourselves, one of you probably already has some kind of semi-auto 308 rifle that you could use for this. You might not already have an AR-RPK, so you could start training that and getting into that way from the get-go. So, from a historical standpoint, when we look at this as well, the reason that like battle rifles kind of fell out of favor over time really came down a lot, mostly to weight, and had the idea that in the same amount of weight, let's just throw out a number, let's say 20 pounds. So for the same 20 pounds, you can have a 308 rifle and maybe 200 rounds of ammunition, or I can give you an AR-15 style rifle and 300 rounds of ammunition. And generally, he who has more rounds wins. So it kind of became this matter of like, I can give you way more opportunities to kill a bad guy, and in a lighter package that you can carry more weight per pound, I mean, more ammo per pound than you can doing it with 308, and you can do it more effectively. So that kind of transitioned over time. We really saw like in Vietnam, most of the guys originally deployed with M14s. It's the shortest lived service rifle in American history. It was built to replace two different guns, and it kind of did that okay, but the war it was put into wasn't really ideal for it. So it was made to replace the M1 Garand and the BAR, and it didn't really do the BAR job very well. It did the rifle job pretty well, but it wasn't made for the conditions of Vietnam. And so it kind of failed out there, and a lot of countries were running FALs, G3s throughout the Cold War, and kind of phased off later on as we get closer into the 90s, and a more adoption of 5.56 across the board with homegrown rifles. We have like the HK93 comes out. We have the Brits doing their weird bullpup stuff. Even the FAMAS kind of goes into a 5.56. So we see NATO swap from 7.62 to 5.56, and the battle rifle kind of falls by the wayside. But then we kind of have this resurgence of it recently, where lessons learned from the global war on terror, the 308 SCAR, the SCAR 17, it got real big and very popular because of the global war on terror. And it was a spec war rifle for a long time. It was kind of used as the idea that you had a heavy caliber rifle with a round that could reach out a little bit further, to a little bit more on impact, and was just as modular and everything as an AR-15 could be. And it was kind of a modernized FAL, if you will. And you could take this and you could go shoot bad guys in the face with it in several barrel configurations, and this would be an effective 308 battle rifle for you. So that kind of started the resurgence of this, especially in Afghanistan, where you had further distances that you were engaging targets and further spots where we go forward and we go into post global war on terror. We now know that SIG has kind of won the contract on their 6.8 by 51 round with the, I think it's the XM5 now, and it's their new kind of the SIG Spear, basically, right? It's this new modular, multi-purpose rifle that's in a heavier caliber. We're kind of going back to 308. It's not a 308, but we're going back towards that heavier caliber round, and again, increasing the distance that we can engage targets. We're also increasing the force that we're delivering to the target itself. So we're kind of seeing this resurgence of battle rifles, and they never really, on the civilian market, they never really went away. They were always there. They've always been loved. The HK91 has been around for a long time. People have always loved it. The FAL has a huge fan history. The M1A is the 1911 of the rifle world. It has been around forever. Everyone loves it for some reason, and no one can tell you. No one really knows why. So Outside of like, for the younger guys too, like with Blackhawk Down, it's the shoe, it's the shoe guard rifle, and a lot of us really fell in love with it from there. So that's kind of like, let's start looking at that and seeing. So now that we've established kind of the historical precedent, some of the pros that you have with these, especially depending on the rifle that you get, is that you have, obviously we've mentioned like the further standoff distance. You've got the benefits of having a heavier caliber cartridge. But if you've got something like an HK91, for example, like a PTR 91 or a G3, you've got dirt cheap magazines. The magazines were widely made by a ton of countries, operated by everybody in a variety of conditions. And so that's one, you have the credibility and the reliability of a rifle that has seen service in every climate and every biome. So you know it's going to work. And some of these are still in service today. I mean, like, heck, Portugal is still running the same G3s they originally bought back in like the 50s or 60s, and they've upgraded some of their furniture on them. But other than that, they're the same friggin' guns, and these things are still running. So with the G3 specifically, there is a lot of aftermarket furniture that's out there because of how long it's been in service and because of all the different nations that have run it. Their spur stocks are really good for them, but they're very modular. And because of them being roller delayed, the buttstock, you can get it in several different variations. You can get collapsible, side folding, all kinds of different ways to make your rifle kind of a little bit more compact. Because it is one of the downsides is the 308 battle rifles do tend to be a little heavier, a little bulkier, and traditionally a lot of them have 20-inch barrels or 20 to 22-inch barrels. That is kind of shortened down over time. So like the M1A coming out with like the SOCOM or the tanker models. The FAL is getting a lot shorter. The G3 is getting shorter. So, 16 and 18-inch barrels are pretty common, but they're still generally larger than your average AR-15. So, some of those are some of the pros. If you go like an FAL, like there's tons of aftermarket stuff out there for them as well. A lot of aftermarket M1A. There's a ton of like a whole other world of crap you can get into that with some of these things. The downside, however, though, is they are not as modular as, say, an AR-15. Even if you go like the AR-10 route. The thing with that a lot of people don't realize is the AR-15, generally most companies go off of mil spec, and if they don't, they generally let you know. So what that means is the ability that we all know that the AR-15 has, where it's basically Legos for grown-ups, you can mix and match uppers and lowers. This trigger from this company, and these springs from that company, and this upper and this lower, and all this stuff. I can put it all together. I can make a gun, right? And as long as I'm using quality parts across the board with similar tolerances, I should have a decent rifle that operates. When it comes to AR-10s, it's not entirely the same. So AR-10s, you have like the stoner cut, you've got the DPMS. I know there's a couple others, but we'll just kind of like look like just with that alone is like it has to do with how the receiver is cut to where on the back by where the buffer tube would go. Some of them are more of a curve, some of them are more of a slant, some of them are more of a straight wall. Like it really just depends on what company you're going with to where if you were going to build an AR-10, it's a lot harder to build than an AR-15 is. So you kind of have to basically figure out what you want and like what your completed rifle wants to be and just pick up the pieces of that part by part, not necessarily with an AR-15 where you can just kind of build it as you go. You basically have to decide like, oh, I want DPMS cut and I'm going to get all DPMS cut stuff because everything has to match because there is no mil spec when it comes to AR-10s. So you have to be a lot more wary and knowledgeable about what you're getting into. And the same applies really to most of the battle rifles out there. If you're going to do like traditional battle rifles, G3, M1A, FAL, there's a lot more knowledge that goes into understanding what you're doing. Even something as simple as suppressing the rifle. Like if you want to suppress a G3, there is a piece in the way that the rifle locks up. There is a piece that you need to replace to run a suppressor that they may and you need to replace it with a piece that makes that's cut at different angles. The problem is they make like 8 to 12 different angles that this thing can be cut that this angle can be cut at, and you really don't know which one is going to work with your suppressor until you start buying a bunch of pieces and mixing and matching. So suppressing the G3 can be a huge pain in the butt. From a lot of people I know who've done it, they've said like ultimately it's really not worth it for what you get out of it, plus the extra wear that it puts on the rollers. Now, as far as the FAL goes, I don't really know too many people who've tried to suppress it. But I've seen like a lot of people when they try to suppress some of the more classic battle rifles, they don't always work out as well because they were never really intended for that. And the M1A, basically a lot of the stuff that you're going to do on there, although it is widely popular, there is a lot of custom. There's a lot of fitting that you need to do and make sure things are in spec and things are all lined up. So there's some more gunsmithing involved with that, and there's entire companies that are dedicated to taking your normal rifle, accurizing it, making sure everything's good. Because they've been made for so long and from so many different places that it is kind of an important thing to make sure that you have a little bit more knowledge going into. So the threshold of knowledge of how to work on your rifle and to change things on it is a little bit higher than it is on an AR-15. So those are some of the cons with that, not to mention the weight, the limited magazine capacity. Generally you have 20 rounds, and magazines are outside of the G3, where magazines you can find for like $4 a piece. Outside of the G3, some of the magazines can be kind of expensive. So from someone who also owns an M1A, magazines on those, if you can find like some Taiwanese ones, because the Taiwanese used to run in the M1As, the M14s, you could sometimes get those for a little under $30. Most of the time, if you're going to buy like a direct from Springfield magazine, you're paying like $50-$60 for those. There's other companies out there that make mags are around the $30 mark, so they're not terrible. But same thing goes for the FALs. I think the FAL mags on generally are like $25. Could be a little bit more than that. But the other thing with the FAL too is, since a lot of countries made them, you have to know if you have an inch pattern or a metric pattern, and make sure that all your accessories, including magazines, are for the appropriate rifle. So if you're going with something more like a SCAR or a B&T or a nice AR-10, something like that, you're going the more modern route. It's a little bit easier because most of your stuff is kind of streamlined and made specific for that, so you don't have to try as hard to find some of the crazier stuff that's out there. So now that we've kind of established like what they are, some pros and cons, I know we're kind of hitting a bunch of stuff kind of fast. Why do I think that you guys should own one? Well, I think realistically, when it comes to like a civilian Minuteman type team, like I kind of mentioned earlier, the AR-RPK and like the light squad weapon is a great concept, but I think that the number of groups of people, the number of how to word this, the number of groups that are going to be able to employ something like that or have something like that, that's not just slap a drum mag in your AR and call it good, but like specifically specialized rifles, whether it's the right red hand uppers or something that's purposely built as a faux machine gun. It's going to be really hard to fill that gap and to give you that fire superiority through volume. So I think it's important for the civilian marksmanship team or the civilian Minuteman team to focus on increasing the engagement distance at which you can engage enemy targets. So if you have something like a DMR or a battle rifle where you can put down fire at a further distance, that the other person is, especially if the other people you are fighting are running an intermediate cartridge like a 5.56, 7.62x39, 5.45, something that most of the world is running, you do have a little bit of an advantage if you can accurately put shots at distance to where you're outside of their effective range, but they're within yours. That gives you a huge benefit. And I think that realistically that might be a little more attainable than for most people than the machine gun style concept. Now, that being said, if you are one of the guys that you've got the money to dish out for it, if you were able to combine the light squad weapon idea or the AR-RPK with the heavier caliber AR-10, you would have a pretty rad setup. It would be heavy, absolutely, but all good machine guns are. You would have a heavy rifle, but it would be able to lay down a lot of fire, and that fire being 308 very rapidly. And the nice thing too about that is, again, going back to kind of like the IAR, concept, or like how the Marines have run with their rifles now, to where instead of they've replaced the saw, where they all have an HK, they all have this kind of like going into like how the Marines are, where they all have the same rifle setup and they have someone designated as the machine gunner now. He runs an IAR, runs a bunch of extra mags through it, and he's kind of the machine gunner there, to where their concept is just like you could do with this AR-10. is that it's, what is more important, instead of just spraying and praying tons of ammunition downrange, is that if you have tons of ammo going downrange, but it's well aimed, accurate fire, to where it might be a little slower of a firing rate than a full auto machine gun, but you're getting a much better effect to where you're putting a lot of rounds at range that are accurate and on target. So that has a whole other realm of psychological capability for it. So from a specialization standpoint, having the ability to have someone with something like a DMR, putting a nice set of glass on a battle rifle, engaging targets at distance. If you can suppress it, great. If not, just running it the way it is like that. That's a huge thing. That's huge. I think that gives you a lot of benefit, and that gives you a lot of capability. The other thing I would say with this too is that if you want to just run it as a battle rifle, like just as a battle rifle, like for example, my G3 is set up with a red dot. I've got an Aimpoint Pro on there, and behind it, it has a 4-power magnifier. If you want to run something like that, to where you could run it in place of a rifle, that also could give you a little bit of advantage in the sense that you are running a heavy caliber rifle. Now, granted, I am limited by ammo capacity and by weight. So for the same amount of magazines on the kit that I run with my G3, I can run, I think I have like 7 magazines on the kit plus one of the gun. Whereas if I were to do it as an AR-15, I could run closer to 10. So I am limited. I could run closer to 10 magazines. So I am limited in my capacity. But I do have a high caliber round that delivers more force on impact that in theory wouldn't necessarily require as many rounds on target to put a target down, and does have a greater psychological effect, at least in my opinion, as a combat rifle employed in a team, to where there may be usage for a heavier caliber rifle. Maybe there's a vehicle or something that needs to get shot down, or maybe things are behind cover. You do have the capability, again, of being able to punch through certain types of cover or certain types of material, like bricks and things like this, or walls, things like that. You can, put more rounds and, more effectively into things like engine blocks. You have a little bit more capability as the threats you can engage outside of just people, or even how you engage those people with a heavier caliber cartridge than you do with something like a 5.56. So there are some definite pros there with that in running in that situation. Now, as far as, again, going back to that team setting, are we saying you have to limit this to just a DMR? No. Like I said, you can run that potentially, like that LMG concept would be super cool if you could manage how to figure that out, and then also have enough ammunition to keep it fed. Running just a standard battle rifle, you could definitely do that. The other thing too is to kind of think of, looking at historical examples of like how has this been used, looking at like the M1A, for example, the M1A as the M21 EBR and the EBR chassis, which if anyone who's played Call of Duty or, spent any time in the military, you have a designated marksman role, a lot of times it generally winds up being one of those where it's an accurized M1A. The idea is, you run that in your team to kind of give you those accurate shots at distance, but also have that capability to just really lay some fuck you at a close distance with some 308. So, I don't want to just, limit this to being a standoff weapon, but it's definitely fits that role. If you want to look again, going back to a historical standpoint, you can see where kind of the employment of, when you start looking at nations who are starting to switch over to lighter rifles like 5.56, and different forms of that, you can sort of see the employment of how they kind of have this mixed in squad integration. And I think a great example of this is actually something I watched on Battle Order from after watching the movie Battle of Long Tan, which is a great Vietnam movie for anybody that's wanting movie recommendations. It's about the Australians fighting in Vietnam, which prior to this movie, I had no idea they were there, but it's a great movie. The Australians in this case, their rifle teams at the time were transitioning kind of between what they called the SLR, which was the FAL, and the M16. And so they were kind of an integrated hodgepodge, to where they had a really interesting squad makeup that made the best use of both rifles. And so the idea here was you had a scout team. This was 2 people, a scout and a secondary scout. They both had M16s. They had lighter rifles. They had a lighter loadout. They still had tons of magazines and everything, but they were ultimately weighed down less than everybody else. And they would scout ahead on point and kind of be the team that would let everybody else know what was coming. Then you had a rifle section. So your rifle section, I think it was 4 guys with rifles and your team leader. And so it was your team leader had an M16, everybody else in that had an FAL. And they were the guys who could lay down heavy, accurate fire very quickly. And then you had your machine gunner team, where you had a machine gunner, an A gunner, who's just an assistant machine gunner, carries the extra ammo, the extra barrels, things like that, helps the machine gunner out, and then your secondary squad leader. And the idea behind this was, if need be, you could split people up, and you would have, your rifle team, and then you would have your scout and machine gunner team if you needed to split into 2 sections, or you could have your scout team running reconnaissance out and about, kind of seeing what's going on, being light on their feet, while the machine gunner sets up a base of fire, and then your rifle section can work in groups of 2, and with or 2 or 3, and assault an objective. So you have a lot of flexibility with this type of makeup. And I think that if you were to take that and kind of flip it on its head, to where instead of everybody mainly having FALs and in the specialists having M16s or an AR style rifle, let's kind of flip that for the modern day and say, let's assume you and your boys are all running ARs. One of you guys has, you have your rifle team where everybody's running ARs, including the team leader, right? Then you have your machine gunner team, which is your AR RPK style concept or whatever you can have to fit that role. And you have your assistant squad leader and your A gunner there, so people to carry extra ammunition for them. What if that scout team, kind of talking about that kind of role of the DMR though, fell into that, to where you could have, a guy with an AR-15 and a guy with, your DMR, or maybe even 2 guys with battle rifles, however you wanted to do it. These could be, your kind of scout team with that, to where with them running a more reconnaissance role in this route, the need for having a ton of ammo on them is not entirely necessary at that point. To where like that the limitation in weight being, not being able to carry as much ammunition as the other guy could be mitigated by the sense that, like, okay, if one guy has the DMR and he's scout 1 and the assistant scout, he could maybe carry a couple of extra magazines for that DMR or for that battle rifle. And then while they're out doing recon and kind of being the point man up ahead, the whole point is to not necessarily engage threats, but to recon the area and let everybody else know what they're walking into. So you're not necessarily anticipating a ton of firefights as that guy. So having being more limited in your ammo capacity is not necessarily a terrible thing in that, because you're not necessarily expected to engage in a higher level of firefighting like you would be with a machine gunner or just some of the standard riflemen. And that being a part of the second team with that, where you have your rifle section, your machine gun section, and then your 2 scouts, if you were to split up into a team of 2, you would have a really strong base of fire in that sense, to where you have your section 1 is your rifle section with your 4 guys with AR-15s and the team leader. They can lead the assault on an objective. Meanwhile, you've got your assistant squad leader back with your A gunner and your machine gunner laying down heavy suppressive fire, to where they can just keep everybody's heads down. Meanwhile, your DMR guy, he's in the back with the assistant scout, and they are laying down accurate fire, taking out threats. The machine gunner's keeping the heads down, and when those heads pop up, the DMR guy's taking them out while your buddies assault the objective. So you can utilize all of these facets in a way that can be really useful, and again, give you a lot of flexibility in situations, whether it be offense or defense. And I made a post a little bit about this on my Instagram, and I think I might do a YouTube video about this in the future, kind of explain it all tabletop, because I'm more of a visual person than I am I'm more of a visual person when it comes to this kind of stuff than I am audio. But I think it's really interesting to look at how, when countries ran battle rifles and they were transitioning into modern lightweight 5.56 rifles, what their theories were, where would they just replace everything? What were the stop gaps? Why would some people run one thing versus the other? And I think it's interesting to look at that and not just get pigeonholed into looking at what the American military has done, but looking at other militaries and how they've done it. I think an important thing too, as an American Minuteman, if you're looking at this kind of stuff, is that, a lot of the way the military works in the United States is based on logistics and is based on a massive logistical billion-dollar multi-industrial complex supporting that combat infantryman. So it might behoove you, I hate the fact that I just said that word, but it might behoove you to look at effective but underfunded militaries. maybe look at other countries that don't have huge military budgets, but are still pretty well known for having good fighting forces. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Right? Kind of dive into their military doctrine. Look at maybe some of our NATO allies, maybe some of the Nordic countries, maybe some of the Slavic nations, things like that. Like just kind of look throughout the world, Australia, things like this, as to kind of dive into that and be like, okay, so what is their military doctrine and why? Well, they don't have a very large military. They're not very well funded, so they have to make do with what they got. Well, guess what? If things go south and you and your boys got to do Minuteman stuff, you're not a very large military and you're not very well funded. So, look at countries like that and how they make the best of what they have, and kind of figure out like, you don't have to take everything that they do and think that it's awesome, but like maybe there's little bits and pieces you can pick up from the different ways that people do things and see like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, or ooh, I like that. Look at maybe countries that are less mobility based as far as like on vehicles and focus a lot more on just like a pure infantry support. Maybe look at countries that don't have a lot of logistical capability and how do they keep their guys ready in the fight? How do they get stuff from point A to point B? And kind of look not just at like guerrilla movements, things like this, but what are professional militaries doing that are underfunded or don't have. Yeah, I would say, if you can, look at other countries' doctrines as well. Don't just get pigeonholed into the United States. United States, we do certain things for a certain reason. But I think if you're looking at things from a Minuteman concept, it doesn't hurt to look at other countries. Look at Russian doctrine, look at American doctrine, look at, NATO, different countries in NATO, look at countries, if, for example, if you're looking at battle rifles, maybe look at countries that employ battle rifles. Why do they still do that? Is it a monetary thing or is there a benefit for them that like maybe doing their circumstances, it works. Maybe for them, that's what's beneficial. Look at these different answers and kind of put it all together, piece together your own opinions on this. These are just my thoughts. I'm just a dude on the internet. I have way too much time on my hands, and I like to think and I like to think about guns, and military doctrine and tactics, things like this. So this is kind of where my mind goes with this. Now, obviously, I would say again, take all of this with a grain of salt. I still think that as a main platform, the AR-15 makes a lot of sense. But for some people, I think that is a specialist role. Unless all of your boys are rocking HK91s, I think it fits more into a specialist role for the battle rifle. But that it's becoming back into popularity, and that it still definitely serves a purpose. Are some of them outdated with certain features or ergonomics? Sure. Are there more modern concepts like the AR-10, the B&T APC, but in 308, the SCAR, things like that? Absolutely. There are great options out there. The downside of this is also a lot of them are pretty expensive. Outside of maybe like, even like Palmetto's AR-10 series that they're coming out with now with kind of some of their Saber stuff and trying to get into that, like the RSAS clones, things like that. It can still be a pretty penny, and you do have to dump a good bit of money in there. Then you got to buy a bunch of 308, which is, a lot more expensive than 5.56. It's like $1 a round, if not more. Especially depending if you're getting more specialty ammo or higher end type of ammo, match ammo, things like that. So it's a whole other investment and world to get into. So with that being said, too, speaking of investments and money, guns, things like that, keep in mind at the time that I'm recording this podcast, there's about 55 days left until the next election. So if it is something that you want to get into, I know it's a little late for me saying that now, but I would say maybe start looking into that a little bit harder and jump on that sooner than later because, I'm not trying to scare anybody or put anybody in gun scares, but realistically speaking, from having spent many years working in the gun industry and many years working behind the counter of the gun shop, when elections come and we have like the whole kerfluffle that was the debate that was last night, guns fly off the shelves, ammo flies off the shelves because everyone gets worried. A lot of us already know too, like out in the zeitgeist right now, we're talking a lot about, what happens after the election. Is there going to be violence? So, there's a lot of people who feel like there is. So that just adds to that scenario. And especially if things do get violent, it'll add even more to it. So if you need to stock up on 308, you need to stock up on whatever ammo, go out, go do that, go do that as necessary. I don't necessarily think everyone needs to go insanely overboard and buy 10,000 rounds and, 48 rifles. But, top off a little bit if you need it. If you need more magazines, go get some. My biggest advice with all that too would be also focus on like spare parts. If if gun legislation does come up in the next year or two, if, regardless really of who wins the election, they keep in mind that you've got to keep running what you already have. And, people will be like, oh, they'll ban guns, but they won't ban the parts. That's exactly what they did in Washington State. So they banned all the parts for them. They didn't ban the guns necessarily themselves. I mean, they banned new ones. You grandfathered everything in, but they said, hey, you can't get parts to support these anymore. So if your gun dies, it dies. So if you saw something like that on a federal level, who knows? But just keep in mind, it is that time of year again. Kind of brush up on what you got, buy what you need if you need it. Don't go into debt. Don't go do anything stupid, but, be responsible about it. But if you are considering something like a 308 battle rifle or a 6.5, something like that, now might be kind of the time to consider that. So with that today, guys, since this was a solo one, it's a little bit shorter. I appreciate everyone for listening. You guys have been awesome. I'm so stoked every time that I get to log on to the app I record this on and see how many of you guys listen in. And I'm just amazed that there's this many people that actually give a shit about what I have to say or just tune in to listen to my ramblings and tell me how wrong I am either way. If you got time, check out our YouTube channel. It's, same name, different place, Mid-Tier Thoughts. On YouTube, we've got some cool stuff on there. If you can, check out www.midtierthoughts.com. I've been trying to push out a bunch more shirts lately. Problem is apparently I keep violating the companies that I use. It's called Teespring. They make the shirts. They're drop shipped. So I've pushed the designs. They put them on the shirt. They send them to you. Makes it a little bit easier on me since I don't have a press yet and I don't have to hold on to inventory. Full disclosure on how all that works. But they also have some guidelines on what can or cannot be on their shirts. And apparently I've been getting a little naughty with some of my designs. So I had one recently. If you follow me on Instagram, you've seen it. It was KFC, but it was Kamala Fried Chicken due to her performance in the debate and the whole, they're eating our cats and dogs thing was basically a picture of a bucket of fried chicken with cats inside of it. So authentic Haitian cuisine. Anyway, you guys get the gist of it. So I'm going to try to keep pushing as much stuff on there as I can. If you want to support me, that's a great way to do it. There are some pretty funny shirts on there that are still up there. So check that out. There's a discount going on right now. It's Trump24 for 10% off. With that though, guys, it's been great. We'll have another episode coming up here soon with me and Muffin Top Tactical, kind of talking about Paul Harrell and kind of our thoughts and opinions and looking back on how he influenced us through life, kind of a tribute to him. So that'll be coming up on the next episode. With that, guys, have a good one. Have a great one. See you on the next one. Peace.